there, it's Ms. Heaton. I'm going to quickly walk you through some of the lab equipment that we'll be using this year in chemistry. First of all, a lot of times we want to hold liquids in some sort of container. The most common container you will use for that is a beaker. This is good for holding larger amounts of liquids. If you would like to hold liquids so that they don't splash, maybe if you're stirring them, you might use an Erlenmeyer flask, which has this triangular shape. You may also hold water, specifically deionized or distilled water, in a wash bottle. It has a spout that spits it out quickly. Also, if you're using a smaller amount of liquid, you may use a test tube. Here they're pictured in a test tube rack. This is good for holding smaller amounts, but even smaller amounts can be put into a well plate, a spot plate, or a well tray. Those are all words that describe the same thing. Primarily, I'll use well plate. You can use a pipette, or sometimes they take off the last T and E here, and that can be used to transfer liquid from one container to another. Now, if you're measuring liquids, you want to use something different than all of those. You want to use something that measures more exactly. Primarily, we'll use graduated cylinders. Here's a 100 and a 10 milliliter graduated cylinder. These have more markings, more gradations than beakers or Erlenmeyer flasks. If you'd like to measure one exact volume, you can use a volumetric flask. These are only marked in one place, and they are calibrated to measure exactly maybe 100 milliliters or 1,000 milliliters. Second semester, we'll get to use a burette, which is similar to a graduated cylinder, but even more precise. It has even more markings on it. Here it's pictured inside a burette clamp, which is attached to an iron rod, going into an Erlenmeyer flask. Also, you may use a repipetter. This is something that's designed to dispense exactly one amount of liquid, say 3 milliliters. And so you just lift up on this white part here and release it, and some of the liquid and the exact amount you need will come out of the spout. Now, if you want to measure mass, you'll use a balance. In this class, we will not measure weight on a scale. Those are both things that refer to pounds. We'll be using grams, which is a mass, and measuring it on a balance. To take a solid and put it onto a balance, you can use a scoopula, or a scooper if you prefer that. But you don't want to scoop it directly onto the balance. Instead, you'll put it maybe into a weigh boat or onto some weigh paper. These are just plastic things that can be reused and are more convenient than, say, a beaker. If you want to mix things together, you have a few options. One is to use a magnetic stir bar. This is a little magnetic device that you can put inside a beaker and then set it on a stir plate. And then when you turn on the stir plate, that white piece will start spinning around and mixing your sample automatically. Though most of the time you will be doing it manually using a stirring rod, which works just the same way like a wooden spoon would when you're cooking at home. If you want to mix two solids together or grind up a solid, you can take a mortar and put the solid in there and then grind it with a pestle. A lot of times you'll want to hold a glass container or a plastic container, and here's a few options. For a test tube, you would use test tube tongs. For a crucible, which we'll talk about in a minute, you would use crucible tongs. For a beaker, you'd use beaker tongs, which is different because it has this plastic part on the end. You could use a test tube clamp if you want to hold a test tube to a ring stand. So these both hold test tubes, but these are attached on this end to a ring stand. Or if you have something small, you could use forceps, which are also called tweezers. Sometimes we will be separating substances, and one way to do that, to separate, say, a solid from a liquid, is to use a funnel. Inside the funnel, you'll fold up a piece of filter paper, and then you can suspend that in an iron ring attached to an iron rod or a ring stand, and then maybe put a beaker underneath to catch the liquid, and all the solid will stay on the filter paper. For heating, you have a couple of different options. The first that we'll use most often is the hot plate. You can also use a Bunsen burner. Typically, if you use a Bunsen burner, you'll have something suspended above it, say on an iron ring, which is attached to an iron rod. You can light the Bunsen burner with a striker here, using the gas that goes through this tube here. On top of that iron ring or on top of the hot plate, you may want to use something like an evaporating dish, which is a little bit larger, or a crucible, which is a little bit smaller and has a lid. If you need to keep it covered, you can put a watch glass on top of your either beaker or crucible or evaporating dish to prevent liquid or solid from splashing out. And oftentimes on top of this iron ring, we'll put wire gauze or a clay triangle, either to hold the crucible or the evaporating dish without it falling through that ring. And obviously, you can measure the temperature with a thermometer. In this class, we'll be using vernier equipment from time to time. You may have used this in a prior class. We'll go through this in more detail at that point, but I want to point out that there are different probes that hook up to the computer. So this picture here has a temperature probe inside a beaker. That temperature probe is connected to the LabPro device, the green thing here, and then that is attached to the computer with a USB cord. There's also a power cord that you can't picture here. And then that USB cord goes into the computer, which has the Vernier software, the LoggerPro software on there. That graphs your data instantaneously. Instead of a temperature probe, you can instead attach a pH probe that measures pH, or you could attach a pressure sensor, which has a syringe attached to it that measures pressure. And last but not least, after you've used all this wonderful lab equipment, it's very important that you clean up properly. If you have some solids stuck in either a well plate or a test tube or a beaker, you can use a test tube brush to scrape it out. You could also use a sponge, but in either case you need to use soap, and hand soap works just fine, soap and water, to clean out any equipment that you have used in class. And that is the key using this year in chemistry. It's Heaton signing out.